Say something smart. Or just keep smiling like you're paid to. The man said, leaning back in his chair as laughter rippled across the table, sharp and effortless, like they had done this 1,000 times before, like people like her were part of the entertainment, not the room, not the moment, just background noise in a place where deals were measured in millions and respect was reserved for those who could afford it. And Naomi Carter stood there, still, her tray balanced perfectly in one hand, her posture straight, her expression unreadable, the soft glow of amber lights reflecting off polished marble floors and crystal glasses, jazz humming low in the background, a scene built to impress. But underneath it all, something colder lingered, something familiar, the kind of silence that comes right before a storm no one sees coming. She had heard it all before, the jokes disguised as charm, the words wrapped in smiles that didn't reach the eyes, the subtle glances that reduced her to a role she never agreed to play. But tonight, something was different, not louder, not crueler, just clearer, every word sharper, every tone more obvious. And instead of shrinking, instead of lowering her gaze like they expected, she listened, not just to what they said, but how they said it, the numbers they mentioned, the confidence they carried, the assumptions they made. Because while they saw a waitress, she saw patterns, she saw gaps. She saw mistakes hidden beneath expensive suits, and louder voices. One of them snapped his fingers again, not even looking at her. "Hey, sweetheart, refill this," he said, pushing his glass forward without a glance. And Naomi stepped in, smooth, precise, pouring just enough, not too much, her movements controlled, deliberate, like every second had weight, like she was exactly where she needed to be, even if no one else realized it yet. "You ever wonder?" Another voice chimed in, half amused, half careless. "What she's thinking when we talk? Probably nothing, right?" More laughter, louder this time, easier, and Naomi's eyes flickered for just a moment, not down, not away, but across the table, catching reflections in glass, catching fragments of conversation, catching the one detail that didn't belong, a number repeated wrong, a clause misunderstood, a deal that looked solid on the surface but cracked underneath. And still, she said nothing, not yet, because moments like this weren't about reacting. They were about timing, about knowing exactly when silence held more power than words. And then it happened, subtle at first, the shift in the room, the kind you feel before you see, the doors at the entrance opening just slightly, a breeze cutting through the warmth, conversations pausing mid-sentence, shoulders straightening, voices lowering, not out of respect spoken, but respect understood. And Naomi didn't turn right away. She didn't need to, because she already knew something had changed. The energy had shifted, and the people who had been laughing just seconds ago suddenly weren't laughing anymore. And when she finally looked up, just enough to see past the reflection in the glass, she saw him, walking in like the room belonged to him, like every deal, every voice, every outcome bent just slightly in his direction. And for the first time that night, the ones who mocked her fell completely silent. The room did not erupt with greetings. It adjusted, like gravity had just shifted, and everyone suddenly remembered where they stood. Chairs straightened, jackets pulled tighter, voices lowered into something more careful, more measured, and the man who had been laughing the loudest just seconds ago now cleared his throat like he needed to reset the version of himself he was presenting. But William Harrington did not acknowledge any of it. Not the eager smiles, not the extended hands, not the subtle attempts to reclaim control. His pace was steady, unhurried, the kind of confidence that did not need to prove itself. And as he moved closer to the table, the air seemed to thin, conversations died mid-thought, and even the soft jazz in the background felt distant, like it no longer belonged in the same moment. Naomi remained still, her tray now empty, her hands relaxed at her sides, her eyes steady. Because while everyone else was reacting, she was watching, measuring, the same way she had been all night. And then he stopped, not at the head of the table, not beside the loudest voice in the room, but directly across from her. A choice so quiet yet so precise that it landed harder than any announcement could have. "Naomi," he said, his voice calm, clear, not raised but impossible to ignore, and the sound of her name in that space cut through the room sharper than any insult had earlier. The same men who had reduced her to a joke now turned, confusion flickering across their faces, searching for context they did not have, searching for control they were already losing. Naomi did not rush to respond. She did not step forward or bow her head. She simply met his gaze, steady, composed. "Yes, sir," she replied, her tone even, professional, but grounded in something deeper, something earned. And William gave a slight nod, the kind that carried weight without needing explanation. "Did you finish reviewing the numbers from section 4? He asked, and the question hung there, heavy, deliberate, and for a brief second, no one moved, because the question itself did not make sense, not to them, not to the ones who thought they understood the room, the deal, the hierarchy. Naomi shifted her weight slightly, not nervous, not hesitant, just precise, like every movement had purpose. "Yes, I did," she said, her voice steady, and she reached into the small pocket of her apron, pulling out a neatly folded piece of paper, something no one had noticed before, something no one thought to look for. And as she unfolded it, the faint sound of paper cutting through silence felt louder than it should have. "There is a discrepancy in the projected returns," she continued, her words clear, measured. "Page 12, line 8. The growth rate was calculated using the wrong baseline. It inflates the valuation by nearly 18%. The words landed one by one, precise, undeniable, and the man who had been leading the conversation earlier felt it first. The shift, the crack forming beneath the surface he thought was solid. His smile faltered, his posture tightened, and for the first time that night, he was not the one in control of the narrative. Eyes darted across the table, searching for confirmation, for denial, for anything that could restore the balance. But William did not look at them. Not yet. His attention remained on Naomi. "Are you certain?" he asked, not challenging, but confirming, and Naomi did not hesitate. "Yes, sir, I double-checked it twice," she said. And then, just for a moment, the room held its breath, because something irreversible had just happened, something no one could laugh off, no one could dismiss. And the people who had been so sure of their place just minutes ago were now sitting in the quiet realization that the person they overlooked, the one they reduced to background noise, had just seen what they missed. And William finally turned his gaze to the rest of the table, slow, deliberate. And when he spoke, his voice carried something colder, something final. "It seems," he said evenly, "we need to reconsider who is actually prepared for this deal." No one spoke at first. Not because they did not have something to say, but because they were trying to understand how everything had shifted so quickly, how a room that felt controlled just moments ago now felt uncertain, fragile, like one wrong word could expose everything they had tried to protect. And the man who had been leading the conversation earlier leaned forward, forcing a small laugh that did not quite land. "That is a bold claim," he said, his voice tighter now, less certain. "We have a full team of analysts who reviewed those numbers." But even as he spoke, his eyes flicked down toward the documents in front of him, scanning, searching, hoping to find something that would prove her wrong, something that would restore the balance he had lost. But Naomi did not interrupt. She did not rush to defend her point. She simply stood there, composed, her presence steady in a room that was beginning to unravel, because she knew something they did not. Truth does not need volume. It only needs time. And William Harrington watched it all unfold without stepping in, without correcting anyone, because this was not his moment to control. It was hers, and slowly, almost reluctantly, one of the men at the table flipped to page 12, his fingers moving faster now, less confident. And then it happened, subtle but undeniable. His expression changed, just slightly, a flicker of realization, followed by something heavier, something closer to concern. He leaned toward the others, whispering just enough to be heard. "The baseline is off." And that was all it took, the quiet confirmation that turned doubt into fact, and suddenly the room that had been so loud earlier felt suffocatingly silent. The same people who had laughed now avoided eye contact, their confidence draining in real time, replaced by calculations, consequences, and the uncomfortable awareness that they had missed something critical, something expensive. And Naomi remained exactly where she was, not stepping forward, not stepping back, because she was not there to take their place. She was there to reveal it. And William finally shifted his attention fully to the table, his gaze calm but firm. An 18% inflation is not a rounding error, he said, his tone even, but carrying a weight that no one could ignore. It is the difference between a smart investment and a reckless one. And no one argued, no one laughed, no one even attempted to recover the moment, because they all knew, the deal they had been so confident in was now hanging by a thread, and the person who had seen it first was the one they had dismissed without a second thought, the one they had reduced to a role that no longer fit. And the irony settled in slowly, heavier with each passing second, because respect had not been given to her when she walked in, but now it was the only thing left in the room that mattered. And as the silence stretched, William turned back to Naomi, his expression unchanged, but his voice softer, more deliberate. "Walk me through it," he said, and for the first time that night, every eye in the room followed her, not out of habit, not out of dismissal, but because they finally understood that the person they overlooked was now the one leading the conversation. And Naomi took a small breath, not to gather courage, but to begin, because this was never about proving them wrong. It was about showing them what they failed to see. Naomi did not raise her voice. She did not rush her words. She simply placed the folded paper gently on the table and turned it toward them, her movements calm, deliberate, like someone who had nothing to prove but everything to reveal. "If you look at the baseline used here," she said, pointing with a steady hand, "it assumes a growth rate based on last quarter's peak, not the yearly average." Her tone was even, clear enough for everyone to follow, but firm enough that no one dared interrupt. And one by one, the men leaned in, not out of authority, but out of necessity, their earlier confidence replaced by quiet urgency, fingers tracing the numbers, eyes scanning faster now, searching for any way to challenge her. But the deeper they looked, the clearer it became. She was not guessing. She was not speculating. She was right. And the weight of that realization settled heavily across the table. That inflates the projected return by nearly 18%. She continued, her voice steady. "Which makes the deal appear stronger than it actually is." The words landed clean, precise, leaving no room for interpretation. And for a moment, no one spoke, because the truth had a way of stripping away noise, of exposing what confidence tried to hide. And William Harrington watched her carefully, not surprised, not impressed in the way others might expect, but certain, like this was exactly what he had anticipated all along. "What happens if we correct it?" he asked, his tone measured, inviting clarity, not challenge, and Naomi did not hesitate. "The valuation drops significantly," she replied, "and the risk increases, especially in the first 12 months. She paused just briefly, not for effect, but to let the numbers settle, to let the reality take shape in a room that had been built on assumptions. And across the table, the man who had mocked her earlier leaned back slowly, his posture no longer relaxed, his expression no longer amused, because now he understood, this was not about embarrassment, this was about consequence, real, measurable consequence, the kind that did not disappear with a joke or a smile. And the others followed, shifting in their seats, adjusting papers, recalculating not just the deal, but their place within it. And Naomi stepped back slightly, not retreating, but giving the moment space, because she was not there to dominate the room. She was there to change it, and the silence that followed was different from before, not filled with tension, but with recognition, the kind that comes when something undeniable has been placed in front of you, and you can either accept it or pretend it does not exist, and no one in that room could afford to pretend, not anymore. And William finally nodded, once, subtle but decisive. "Then we adjust," he said, his voice calm, but carrying finality. And with that single sentence, the direction of the entire deal shifted, not because of authority alone, but because of truth that could not be ignored. And as the room slowly began to move again, quieter now, more careful, the same people who had dismissed Naomi just minutes ago now avoided meeting her eyes, not out of disrespect, but because they no longer knew how to face what they had overlooked. And Naomi simply turned, reaching for her tray again, her expression unchanged, her posture the same, as if nothing extraordinary had happened, but everything had, because respect had not been asked for. It had been earned in a way no one in that room would forget. The room did not return to what it was before. It could not, because something invisible had been broken and replaced with something far more real. And as the conversation slowly restarted, it carried a different tone, quieter, sharper, every word now measured instead of performed. And the same man who had mocked Naomi earlier reached for his glass, but did not drink, his hand pausing midair as if he was no longer sure what role he was supposed to play, because confidence without certainty had nowhere to stand. And across the table, papers shifted, numbers were recalculated, voices dropped into hushed discussions that no longer included laughter, and Naomi moved through it all with the same calm precision, collecting empty glasses, adjusting place settings, her presence unchanged on the surface, but impossible to ignore beneath it, because now every movement she made carried a different weight, not as a server, but as someone who had already altered the outcome of the night. And William Harrington remained seated, observing, not intervening, allowing the room to settle into its new reality. Because leadership was not always about speaking first. Sometimes it was about knowing when the truth had already done the work for you. And after a few minutes, he leaned back slightly, his gaze shifting between the faces at the table, reading them the way Naomi had read the numbers. And what he saw was not strength, not anymore, but hesitation, calculation, doubt. And finally he spoke, his voice calm but unmistakably firm. "We will revise the structure before moving forward," he said, and no one argued, not because they agreed completely, but because they no longer had the ground to stand on, and the man who had led the earlier discussion forced a nod, slower this time, his expression controlled but strained, because agreement now felt less like a choice and more like a necessity, and the shift was complete, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. The power in the room had moved, not through force, but through clarity, and as the meeting continued, Naomi stepped slightly away from the table, her tray once again in her hands, her role visually unchanged, but internally redefined, because she had already done what no one else could, and for a moment, as she turned toward the service station, she allowed herself a single breath, steady and quiet, not relief, not pride, just acknowledgement, because moments like this were not accidents, they were built, slowly, patiently, through nights of being overlooked, through conversations where she listened instead of spoke, through details others ignored because they believed they did not need to look closer, and behind her, the conversation shifted again, this time more focused, more cautious, but no longer dismissive, and one of the men finally glanced in her direction, just briefly, not with arrogance, not with amusement, but with something new, something closer to respect, though he did not say it, did not know how to say it. Because respect earned in silence does not demand recognition, it changes behavior. Instead, and William noticed it, the subtle shift, the way the room now oriented itself differently. And as Naomi returned to the edge of the room, blending once again into the background by choice, not by assumption, he spoke once more, quieter this time, but directed, intentional. "Naomi," he said, and the single word carried through the room with the same clarity as before, and every head turned again. Not out of curiosity now, but out of understanding, because whatever came next, they knew. One thing for certain, she was no longer invisible. Naomi paused just for a fraction of a second when she heard her name again, not because she was unsure, but because she understood that this moment was different from the last. The room was no longer reacting to surprise, it was waiting, and waiting carried a different kind of weight. She turned back toward the table, her steps measured, her expression calm, and William Harrington gestured slightly toward the empty chair beside him. Not dramatically, not for effect, just enough to make it clear. "Join us," he said, his tone even, as if it were the most natural request in the world, but nothing about this was ordinary, not for the people watching, not for the ones who had spent the last hour deciding who belonged and who did not. And the silence that followed was thicker now, layered with something closer to realization, because this was no longer about a corrected number. This was about position, about presence, about who had the right to sit at the table, and Naomi did not rush to accept. She did not hesitate either. She simply placed her tray down on the service stand beside her, smoothing the edge of her apron with one steady motion, and stepped forward, each step quiet but deliberate. The soft echo of her shoes against the polished floor somehow louder than before, and when she reached the chair, she did not look around for permission. She did not seek approval. She simply sat, her posture straight, her presence grounded, as if she had always belonged there, even if no one else had seen it until now. And across from her, the same man who had mocked her earlier shifted in his seat, his eyes flickering away for a moment, not out of defiance, but because he did not know how to reconcile the image in front of him with the assumptions he had made. And William leaned slightly forward, his attention focused. "Walk us through the full impact," he said, his voice calm but directive. And Naomi nodded once, her hands resting lightly on the table, not claiming space, but not giving it away either. "If the baseline is corrected," she began, her tone clear, controlled, "the projected return drops below the threshold required for the current structure." She spoke without hesitation, each word precise, each point connected. And as she continued, the room followed, not interrupting, not questioning, because they had already learned what happened when they underestimated her. "It means the risk is front-loaded," she added, "and the recovery period extends beyond 18 months instead of 12. The numbers settled into the room like facts that could not be negotiated, and one of the men reached for his pen, not to challenge, but to keep up, to document what he should have already known. And for the first time that night, Naomi was not adjusting to the room was adjusting to her. And William watched quietly, not stepping in, not correcting, because this was not about proving authority, it was about recognizing it. And as Naomi finished outlining the implications, the silence returned, but it was no longer uncertain, it was focused, the kind of silence that follows clarity. And William gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, but "Enough, then we restructure," he said, and the decision landed with finality, not debated, not delayed, because the direction was now clear. And around the table, heads nodded, slower this time, more deliberate, not out of habit, but out of understanding. And Naomi sat there, composed, her presence steady, not seeking acknowledgement, not needing it, because the shift had already happened, not in words, but in the way the room now saw her. And as the meeting moved forward, one thing became undeniable. She had not just entered the conversation, she had changed it. The shift did not stop at the table. It spread, quiet but undeniable, like a ripple moving through still water, and the same voices that once filled the room with careless confidence now carried caution, each word chosen, each statement weighed, because they were no longer speaking to impress each other. They were speaking in a space that had already exposed them. And Naomi remained seated, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, not elevated by the moment, not overwhelmed by it, just grounded, as if this version of her had always existed beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to be seen. And across from her, the man who had mocked her earlier finally spoke again. But this time his tone was different, stripped of performance. "How did you catch that?" he asked, the question simple, but carrying something heavier beneath it. Not just curiosity, but admission. And Naomi looked at him briefly, not with judgment, not with triumph, just with clarity. "I listened," she said, her voice calm, "and I checked what did not match." And the answer landed harder than any explanation could have, because it revealed something none of them wanted to admit, that the difference between being right and being wrong was not always intelligence. Sometimes it was attention, and the room absorbed that quietly, each person processing it in their own way. And William Harrington leaned back slightly, his gaze moving between them, observing not just the conversation, but the shift in behavior. The way the dynamic had realigned without force, without instruction, simply because the truth had been introduced at the right moment. And one of the investors cleared his throat, adjusting his notes. "If we restructure based on that correction," he said carefully, "we can still salvage the deal, but the margins will be tighter." And for the first time that night, the discussion moved forward with substance, not ego, with precision, not assumption, and Naomi contributed when necessary, not dominating, not withdrawing, just present, her voice entering the conversation at the exact moments it needed to. And as the minutes passed, something else became clear. This was not an exception, not a lucky observation. This was how she thought, how she processed, how she saw what others overlooked because they believed they did not need to look closer. And the respect that formed around her was not loud. It did not come with apologies or grand statements. It showed itself in smaller ways, in the way no one interrupted her, in the way questions were directed to her without hesitation, in the way the room now adjusted its rhythm to include her instead of exclude her, and William noticed all of it. The transformation that had taken place not just in the deal, but in the people around the table. And after a moment, he spoke again, his voice calm but carrying a different kind of weight. "We move forward with the revision," he said, and this time there was no pause, no hesitation, just agreement, quiet but unanimous. And as the decision settled, Naomi allowed herself a brief glance across the table, not to measure, not to judge, but simply to acknowledge what had changed, because this was never about proving them wrong. It was about showing them what they failed to see. And now they saw it, clearly, undeniably, and as the meeting continued, one thing remained certain: the person they had dismissed at the beginning of the night was now the one shaping how it would end. The conversation no longer felt like a performance. It felt like work, real work, the kind that required attention instead of ego. And as the final points were aligned and the revised structure took shape, the tension that once filled the room dissolved into something quieter, something more grounded, and William Harrington closed the folder in front of him with a soft, deliberate motion, a signal that did not need explanation. "We proceed with the adjusted terms," he said, his voice calm. Final. And this time the agreement around the table was immediate, not forced, not negotiated, just understood, because there was nothing left to challenge. The numbers had spoken, and more importantly, the person who revealed them had changed how everyone now saw the room itself. And as chairs shifted and papers were gathered, the same men who once filled the space with laughter now moved with a different kind of awareness, one that made them slower, more careful, more deliberate, and one by one, they stood, offering brief nods, quiet acknowledgments, not loud enough to call attention, but enough to recognize what had happened without needing to say it out loud. And Naomi rose from her seat as well, her movements as composed as they had been from the beginning, not lingering in the spotlight, not holding on to the moment, just stepping back with the same quiet control she carried into it. And as she reached for her tray again, returning it to her hands as naturally as if nothing had changed, everything had already changed, and William stood last, his gaze briefly following the others as they exited, before settling once more on Naomi, not as a superior looking down, but as someone who had seen something worth acknowledging. And he took a step closer, his voice lower now, meant only for her. "You did not just catch a mistake," he said, his tone steady, thoughtful. "You changed the direction of a 9-figure deal." And Naomi met his gaze without hesitation, her expression calm, not surprised, not seeking praise. "I just paid attention," she replied. The same answer, the same truth, but now it carried even more weight, because it had already proven itself. And William allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile, not of amusement, but of recognition. "That is rarer than you think," he said quietly. And for a moment, the room held a different kind of silence, not the silence of tension, but the silence of understanding. And then Naomi gave a slight nod, respectful but grounded, and turned back toward her work, because for her, this was not an ending. It was just another moment in a long series of moments where she chose to see what others ignored. And as she moved through the now quieter room, resetting glasses, aligning chairs, restoring order to a space that had just been transformed, the echoes of earlier laughter felt distant, almost unreal, replaced by something far more lasting. And behind her, William paused for just a second longer before leaving, his mind already moving forward, but carrying with it one clear realization. The most valuable person in the room had never been the loudest, the richest, or the most confident. It had been the one no one thought to notice, until it was too late to ignore. The room slowly returned to its rhythm, but it was not the same rhythm it had before. Something had shifted beneath the surface, something permanent, and Naomi moved through it with quiet precision, resetting glasses, aligning chairs, restoring order as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But the truth lingered in every corner, in the way conversations softened when she passed, in the way eyes followed her not with judgment, but with awareness. And across the room, near the exit, the man who had laughed the loudest earlier hesitated for a moment, his hand on the back of his chair, his posture uncertain, as if he wanted to say something but did not know how to begin. And in the end, he said nothing, because some realizations do not come with words, they come with silence. the kind that forces you to sit with what you were wrong about. And Naomi did not look at him, not out of dismissal, but because she did not need to. The moment had already spoken for itself, and as she carried a tray back toward the service station, the weight of it felt the same as it always had, steady, familiar, grounding, because this was still her job, still her space. But now it carried something more, something that could not be taken away, not by a comment, not by a glance, not by assumption. And behind her, the last of the guests began to leave, their voices quieter now, their steps less certain, as if each of them was carrying a version of the night they would not easily forget. And William Harrington paused just outside the doorway, turning back for a brief moment, his gaze finding Naomi once more, not to call her out, not to draw attention, but to acknowledge what had already been made clear, and he gave a small nod, subtle but deliberate, the kind of recognition that does not need to be spoken to be understood. And then he left, the door closing softly behind him, and the room exhaled, the tension fully gone now, replaced by something quieter, something lasting. And Naomi stood for a moment at the edge of the room, her hands resting lightly on the tray, her eyes scanning the space she had just transformed without ever trying to. And for the first time that night, she allowed herself the smallest shift in expression, not a smile, not pride, just a quiet understanding. Because this was never about changing how they saw her. It was about revealing who she had been all along. And as she turned back to her work, the lights reflecting softly across polished surfaces, the music returning to its gentle rhythm, one truth remained, clear and undeniable. They had laughed when they thought she did not matter, but by the end of the night, they were the ones who realized they had been the least important voices in the room. And Naomi, without raising her voice, without demanding attention, had rewritten the entire story.